Thank you, Marcy. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the inaugural session of Not So Current Politics. I want to take just a minute to explain how this all came about. As I was in the middle of preparing for the May session of Current Politics, I was thinking at whether there was something else that I might do as part of the community, recognizing that I'm in the high-risk population and trying to stay at home as much as I can, and not liking the idea of making cold calls on the phone. And about the same time, I got an email from Karen Isaacson, who said, is there anything else that you would be willing to present? And so I put the two things together, and I said, well, I'll give it a try. If I take the idea of
I'm on,
current
but I can't
politics
hear him.
and apply it to material that's not so current,
John
would it
Levin?
get us anywhere?
Yeah.
The premise that I'm working from is that today's political landscape is the product in part of long ago issues and conflicts that never completely went away, but mutated and reappear in a slightly different form. I'm not suggesting that there's direct causal links or that history exactly repeats itself or anything like that, but that the topics of discussion, at least in a basic sense, don't change all that much over time. They're applied to different circumstances and they come up again in different contexts. Just as a contemporary example of this, I'd cite the decision of the Supreme Court on Monday concerning employment rights for gay and transgender Americans, which, as you know, if you read about it, the opinion written by Justice Gorsuch focuses heavily on the implications of the word sex in the 1964 Civil Rights Act. And as several commentators have pointed out, there's absolutely no evidence that the drafters of the 1964 Civil Rights Act had gay and lesbian or transgender Americans in mind at all. Nevertheless, the word sex, once it's put into the Civil Rights Act and becomes a focus of decisions, establishes principles that go beyond the immediate moment and are available then.
Well, I can come up with a lot of things for me to do.
And that's sort of what I'm going to try to suggest.
I haven't done it all
about the material
for a long time.
Somebody's competing with me. Okay.
Marcy, you need to turn off your mic.
Someone has their volume on. Now, these resonances that I'm describing can be reconstructed in retrospect, even if they're not obvious at the time. Doing this as an experiment, I may convince you that you were right if you hated history when you studied it back in school. And in that case, this won't last very long. It may seem too remote to understanding current issues, but we'll give it a try. I'm going to do one this month, one next month. If it's a success, we may continue with a couple during the regular academic year. It won't be a long series because there are not all that many topics that I know enough about that I can make this argument that there are continuities across time. I picked as my topic tonight the question, how did American politics become polarized? There's a certain symmetry in that because when I started doing the current politics class 5 years ago, that was the very first topic that we took up. And I'm going to preview my argument and say it became polarized during the 1790s in a context that did not make room for disagreement, but which disagreement inevitably occurred. And I mentioned that argument at the outset because it's going to take me a while to put it together. I want to start by a working definition of what I mean by polarized. And I'd say that polarization does not mean just a closely divided vote or a nearly even vote, but it has certain characteristics. It's characterized by a sharp disagreement between people such as an alignment strictly by party, when once you know what party you belong to, you can predict all kinds of other things about your belief, over issues that both parties involved judge to be significant issues and that are defended in terms of first principles or ultimate values that are not open to compromise. So it involves political discussion that very quickly gets to the level of bedrock assumptions that there's no going past. The more often this process is replicated, the more politics can be said to be polarized. For example, I cite here, and I may get to again at the end, statement by Senator McConnell shortly after the election of 2008, when he led the Senate Republicans in a decision that they would, across the board, oppose whatever measures on whatever subjects President-elect Obama was to put forth. Well, that's a recipe for almost constant polarization. Now, one other introductory comment before we get into the heart of this. The other day, I was reading a synagogue report on a different topic that made the comment that the average age of Beth Emmet adult members is 62. Well, that got me to thinking. That means that there are lots of us that grew up in the late 50s or the 60s or the early 70s. And that was a period of time in our politics that kind of shapes the baseline assumptions that a lot of people of this age bring to the table. It was a time when there was political conflict, yes, but it largely took place within a commonly accepted framework without a lot of challenge to basic assumptions. For instance, almost everybody subscribed to what we could now call the Cold War consensus, that we were in a Cold War, that it was a bitter struggle with ideological opposition to communist nations that were bent on expansion and so on. And the issue in our politics was who could best deal with that, or what sort of policies would best confront that. There was a consensus on relatively modest involvement of the government in the economy. There was, despite either fears or promises, depending on your point of view, no move to scale back the New Deal in any of its essential aspects. There was a commitment to consumerism and economic growth, and general social norms and mores fostered conformity. At least that's my recollection of that period of time looking back from today. Now, it's natural that people's formative years, their coming of age years, are what they take as the baseline for what politics is like. And subsequent events are seen either as continuing that or deviating from that. So for a lot of people asking the question, how did our politics become polarized? That question translates to, how did we change from the 50s and 60s to the kind of political context that we have today? But I want to ask this question. Suppose we have the figure and ground reversed. Suppose it was the 50s and 60s and 70s that was the aberration, and that the norm across time has been polarized politics. How then do we explain it? Or if not that, what if we assume that our history across time has consisted of some periods that were fairly polarized and some periods that were fairly not, and one would lead to the other in some kind of succession or progression, not automatically, not in a formulistic kind of way, but over time, that's what happened. And that's what I think a good case can be made for. Now, I said I'm going to date the advent of political polarization to the 1790s. There are people who would go back further than that and say the lead up to the American Revolution began the process of polarized politics. And here's the puzzle that they're trying to solve. The various taxes that the British government imposed on the colonies were relatively small, relatively slight. They didn't raise very much money. They didn't cause very much damage to people. And you have to ask yourself, well, if that's the case, how could taxation without representation come to justify this vast political revolution? And the answer that some have come up with, particularly the historian Bernard Bailyn, by studying the pamphlets of that era, is the people that were agitating were seeing these taxes in a larger context as the first step in a concerted plot to take away the rights of Englishmen from the American colonists. Now, that way of thinking has many of the characteristics of political polarization. Seemingly trivial events take on a larger significance. In fact, nothing is trivial if you really understand it. And they're connected as part of a design. The design is unfolding without being revealed to us. The design consists of a nefarious plot to undermine something that's basic and fundamental. And that's what polarized politics is like. But the difficulty that I have with picking that as the starting point is the country was divided in many ways. And it's not the case that it polarized between revolution and continued subservience to Britain. There were lots of points in between. And there was about a third of the colonial population that was fairly apathetic throughout the whole revolution. So while I think Bailyn is right in saying that's an intellectual justification for the American Revolution, and it contributes to a polarizing discourse, I don't think it polarizes the entire political environment. The period of time that I want to focus on starts with the convention that produces the US Constitution, and then leads to the process of ratifying that Constitution in state conventions, and then putting it into practice during the early years that were dominated by the Washington administration. Let me go fairly quickly over some of the background. The 1780s pretty clearly demonstrated the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation. For anybody for whom the Articles of Confederation are buried way back in your memory someplace, the key point to understand about them is that they produced a confederal structure of government. That means one in which there is a weak central government and sovereignty resides at, in this case, at the state level. The analog to a contemporary confederal government is the United Nations, where the United Nations does not override the sovereignty of the individual member nations. That led to a number of weaknesses in the 1780s. The central government could only ask for and not require payments from the states. It could not tax the citizens directly. It required in the Confederation Congress unanimous agreement among the states to adopt any major policy action. And ultimately, Shays' Rebellion in Western Massachusetts, which was over taxation, exposed the weakness of the ability of the central government to enforce it. So there was a call for a convention to propose and consider changes in the Articles. The convention exceeded that charge and proposed a whole new constitution, and justified it by saying they weren't enacting anything, they were just proposing, and if the voters wanted to go this way, if the states wanted to go this way, well, then that's what we would do. The country was divided. about how serious the weaknesses of the Confederation were. And the people that were most concerned were the people, by and large, that lived in the cities along the coast, along the Atlantic coast. And those on the frontier, by which I meant the western part of Virginia, what's now Kentucky, the western part of Pennsylvania, New York, Massachusetts, the beginning of settlements across the Appalachians, and so on, were much less concerned about the problems of the Articles and much more concerned about a threat to their personal liberty. But while that was centered in the West, the most articulate defenders of that view were in the East, where they were in the minority and as a result didn't get elected to the Constitutional Convention. So the Constitutional Convention was fairly homogeneous. And I say that not only in the obvious sense that there were no women, no African Americans, no poor, etc., but it was homogeneous in its world view, that there were serious problems with the Articles that needed to be remedied, and that what was needed was more energy in the government, a stronger central government that had some degree of sovereignty to itself. And people disagreed about how much sovereignty it should have and how much the states should retain. When the convention sent the Constitution out to the states for ratification, the outcome was highly in doubt. And the whole story of the ratification of the Constitution, I think, is fascinating, but it's not directly relevant to what we're dealing with tonight. But one scholar about 80 years ago, examining the newspapers and whatever measures of public opinion there were, estimated that at the start of the ratification controversy, a little over half of the population was opposed to changing from the Articles to this new Constitution. And particularly in doubt were two of the most critical states, Virginia and New York, where a combination of tactics of argument and appeal produced very slight majorities ultimately in favor. Virginia ratified by a vote of 89 to 79 in its convention. New York ratified by a vote of 30 to 27. And while the Constitution itself said that it would go into effect whenever 9 states ratified it, Virginia and New York, who became the 10th and 11th, were absolutely critical because of their economic weight and their geographic position. They'd chop up the country if they did not ratify. The most significant opponent of the Constitution was Patrick Henry in the Virginia ratifying convention. People tried to convince him that momentum was going in favor of ratification, that 8 of the 9 states had already ratified. Patrick Henry said, I don't care if 12 and a half states have ratified it, Virginia's not going to. He presented worst case scenarios of what the concentration of power in the national government would lead to. So he also made slippery slope arguments, but they didn't convince people, enough people, because they didn't really resonate with people's lived experience at the time. One thing that became clear during the ratification process was that if you turn down the Constitution, you're not likely to get something better. Some people said, well, let's send all these delegates back to Philadelphia and let them go back to work and see if they can come up with a better document. And for a variety of reasons, people became convinced that that wasn't going to happen. And as a result, once the Constitution was ratified, it very quickly got almost universal support. Nobody was saying, let's repeal and replace, to coin a phrase. Instead, they said, let's accept and live by the Constitution, but they understood it very differently. And the biggest difference was between those who came to be called strict constructionists and those who came to be called loose constructionists. The strict constructionists maintained the Constitution does not allow anything that it doesn't specifically enumerate, and the loose or broad constructionists took the position that the Constitution allows whatever it does not prohibit. And as a result, differences of interpretation were highly predictable. Now, one thing that was broadly agreed upon was the 18th century conception of the term virtue. Virtue was understood to mean a preference for the public good over private interests. And the opposite of that preference for the public good over private interests is what characterized factions. If there was a devil term in this whole constitutional process, it was the term faction. Faction was seen as privileging personal interest, party interest, economic interest, regional interest, whatever kind of narrower interest over the public good. Moreover, these framers of the Constitution believed that the nature of virtue was self-evident, that virtuous people would be those who understood almost self-evidently what was in the public interest as distinct from what was in the private interest. That means they defined their opponents, when they had opponents, as factional, but did not see themselves as factional. They were public-minded, interested in the common good, and their opponents were the ones who were favoring special interests. Now, the most obvious embodiment of a faction was a political party. And this is the basis for the founders' opposition to parties. They stood against the common interest or the public good. Here, for example, is a description by Ron Chernow, who is the biographer of Alexander Hamilton, the book that inspired the musical. And he wrote, "The sudden emergence of parties set a slashing tone for politics. Since politicians considered parties bad, they denied involvement in them, bristled at charges that they harbored partisan feelings, and were quick to perceive hypocrisy in others. And because parties were frightening new phenomena, they could be easily mistaken for evil conspiracies, lending a paranoid tinge to political discourse. The Federalists saw themselves as saving America from anarchy, while Republicans believed they were rescuing America from counter-revolution. Each side possessed a lurid, distorted view of the other, buttressed by an idealized sense of self. Finally, no sense existed of a loyal opposition to the government in power." Now that's the phenomenon that results when you see virtue as self-evident. You have no place for legitimate disagreement. The notion of interest group competition or partisan competition or policy-based competition doesn't exist. If you don't support what is deemed to be the virtuous or the public interest policy, you're little short of treason. And that's what happened. Going into the Washington administration, the Constitution was designed for a government in a system in which the leaders were people of virtue and virtue was self-evident. The people were generally distrusted. Democracy was regarded as a bad thing because it had the potential of leading to mob rule. That people would succumb to the appeal of demagogues, appealing on the basis of narrow self-interest, and would be led astray from virtue. Now, by the way, don't get me wrong, the founders also thought that monarchy and oligarchy in their pure form were bad things too. And the objective of the government, of the Constitution, was to create a government in which each of those forces would be checked by the others. That's what was meant by checked and balances. So the people were competent for some things. They could recognize who among their neighbors were the most virtuous. but they could not themselves recognize what policies represented the greatest virtue. So that's, by the way, how come the Constitution was developed with indirect elections for senators. Instead of senators being elected by the people directly, the senators were elected by the state legislatures, who in turn were ultimately elected by the people. It's why they created the Electoral College, because they distrusted the people to elect a president directly, but they did trust people to elect those of their neighbors, and then in a stratified process, who would ultimately pick the president. So that's the framework within which the government got started. Now, it doesn't take 230 years of hindsight to be able to say you could have predicted that that won't work. You could have predicted that severe differences would arise, if only because there were people who were interpreting the Constitution very broadly and convinced that they were right, and there were people who were interpreting the Constitution very strictly or narrowly and convinced that they were right. So, division is likely. There are different economic interests, different social and political attitudes. The framers, who were largely elites, were generally out of touch with the feelings of the lower classes, and so on. And these differences coalesced into factional, not formally partisan, but in effect partisan differences. And the recognized leaders of the two opposing groups in the 1790s emerged as Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson. Hamilton's stock in recent years has been on the rise, largely as a result of the musical. Jefferson's stock in recent years has been on the decline, largely because of changing attitudes about slavery in that time and continuing turbulence in attitudes about race. But in their time, they were fairly evenly matched. Each of them represented legitimate points of view, and each of them was at the center of a much larger aggregate of people. Now, without going into detail, or trying to avoid going into detail, let me just tick off a few of the things that came up in the 1790s that provoked these differences. One, Hamilton's report on public credit and manufactures that recommended deliberately creating a national debt in order to get revenue to support and to encourage manufacturing, which was finally accepted as part of a compromise, in return for which the federal capital would be located in the South, in what became Washington, D.C. Two, Hamilton's proposal for a national bank, which stimulated controversy about whether or not this was a legitimate power of Congress. Three, the proposal to have the federal government assume the state debts incurred in the Revolutionary War, which disfavored the South, which had largely paid off its war debts, favoring the North. Four, an excise tax on carriages, which was widely seen by those who didn't like it as the first step in confiscatory taxation of the rich. Five, and this is one of my favorites, the use of the army to put down the Whiskey Rebellion in Western Pennsylvania in 1794. One of the more outrageous arguments that I make on occasion is that the Whiskey Rebellion is a much underappreciated event in the development of government and politics as we've come to know it. And I'll say a little bit about that in a while. And six, Jay's treaty with Great Britain. The Jefferson faction identified itself with France and its democratic aspirations. The Hamilton faction with Britain and the order and stability of the monarchy. Jay's treaty effectively secured British protection for the American Navy in return for our agreement not to challenge British violation of American neutral rights. Okay, now I don't want to go into those controversies individually, but what they have in common is the way people argued about them. And remember, there's no space, there's no such thing as legitimate political disagreement or differences of opinion. So the typical pattern of controversy was first to identify that there's a difference in views. Second, to define that difference as one of basic principle, not just opinion. Third, to identify the opposing position with a pejorative label that makes it a significant threat. And these were often provided through the lenses of the French Revolution, which was going on at the same time. So the Jefferson faction would argue that its opponents are in effect throwing away sympathy for free peoples trying to get out from under tyranny. And the Hamilton faction would argue in effect that its opponents are trying to recreate the reign of terror in this country as was happening in France. And then to top it off, both sides employed a rhetorical form known as the Jeremiad. For those of you who were waiting when I was going to talk about the Hebrew Bible, here we go. Jeremiad is a style of discourse associated obviously with the prophet Jeremiah, and it consists of declaring problems to be tests sent by God to determine whether our punishment should be made worse if we fail to repent. For example, the true Jeremiad form would say that COVID-19 is a divine punishment for the sins of the world, whatever you take them to be. And not only that, it's a warning that unless we repent of those sins, things will get even worse. This was a very common rhetorical form that was used in the 1790s and earlier. It has since been secularized, so that when people make this line of argument, they tend not to see the tests as coming from God, but from communists, from an alien foreign nation, from immigrants, from the deep state. But the form is basically the same, that these chastisements are sent as both punishments and warnings. And what results from that kind of pattern repeated over and over again is a polarizing discourse of excess. Let me just give you a couple of examples. Here is James Madison, colleague of Jefferson's, fulminating against Alexander Hamilton. He charged that the report on public credit favors the North over the South by the way it treats debtors. He described this as a plot showing how the central government is going to oppress the South. That led him to repudiate his support for the Constitution. At the time it had been ratified. He said, I made a mistake. By the way, he changed his mind again before he became president, decided it was okay. George Mason, another colleague of Madison's and Jefferson's, another Virginian, said Hamilton did more damage to liberty than Great Britain did because he regarded the people as a swinish multitude. And Hamilton's act was labeled incipient monarchy and linked to England as a portent for America's future. Counterexample, Hamilton against Jefferson. Hamilton reacted to character assassination in the newspapers, which he believed, probably correctly, had been planted by Jefferson. And he generalized this abuse to say that Jefferson thought nothing of national honor and favored disunion. And he harked back to a proposal Jefferson had made at the time of the Constitutional Convention that 9 states should ratify the Constitution so it could go into effect, but the other 4 should hold back so that they'd have to make changes in it and amendments in order to get their approval. And concluded that Jefferson was really an enemy of the Constitution. And he labeled Jefferson's conduct as incipient demagoguery, the means by which democracy would lead to tyranny by stirring up the poor against the rich. Each side employed a highly partisan newspaper to spread its view. So the notion of CNN or MSNBC versus Fox is not a new notion. The only thing that's changed is the technology. Each side excoriated the other in a highly partisan newspaper, and if you read both newspapers' accounts of an event, you wouldn't know that you were reading about the same event. So now the question is, what's the role of Washington in all of this? Washington came into office universally understood as the embodiment of virtue, the preference for the public good over the private interest. When people talked about virtue, they had Washington in mind. Both factions vied for his support and tried to get him to align with them as opposed to the other faction. And what that produced was a kind of schoolboyish tattling where Jefferson and Hamilton would run to Washington and say, did you know Jefferson was doing so-and-so, or did you know that Hamilton was doing so-and-so? Here are just a few examples. Jefferson told Washington that Hamilton was responsible for the alarming growth of a get-rich-quick mania, speculative bubble, which had introduced its poison into the government itself. He said that the Treasury Department, Hamilton was Secretary of the Treasury, possessed such an influence as to swallow up the whole executive power. He went to Washington and said that Hamilton had pronounced the Constitution to be, quote, a shilly-shally thing of mere milk and water which could not last and was only good as a step to something better, end quote. Well, that's what Jefferson is doing, going to Washington to vilify Hamilton. Hamilton gave as good as he got. Speaking of these attacks on him in the newspaper, he said, I feel that I merit them in no degree, and expressions of indignation sometimes escape me in spite of every effort to suppress them. It is a curious phenomenon in political history that a measure which has elevated the credit of the country should bring upon the authors of it obloquy and reproach. Now, Washington was in a difficult position. He could not identify with either side and maintain his position as the embodiment of virtue, as the person that is above this kind of fray and sees the difference between the public good and private interest. He believed that the differences between Jefferson and Hamilton could be resolved within the government, and for a couple of years he kept both men in the cabinet, Jefferson as Secretary of State. Jefferson, for other reasons, decided to resign in 1793 and go back to Monticello. And when that happened, Hamilton had no effective counterweight within the administration, and Washington began to tilt in his direction. And that brings me to the favorite case that I said I wanted to discuss, and that's Washington's involvement in the Whiskey Rebellion. What you say? This has to be a very minor incident, and that's usually how it's portrayed by historians. But it seems to me that it had a lot to do with the institutionalization of polarized politics. So let me give a bit of the background. Congress had passed an excise tax on whiskey in 1791 that was very unpopular out on the frontier for a variety of reasons. It meant that revenuers would come onto your land to inspect your stills. It meant that you were hurt because you would often turn your corn into whiskey for shipment and transportation, and so on. So they protested the Whiskey Rebellion. Their resistance was weak until it was supported by a group of organizations known as democratic societies, which were trying to gin up American support for the French Revolution. Finally, there was an outbreak in western Pennsylvania, not far from Pittsburgh. The house of John Neville, a wealthy resident who had agreed to be the excise inspector, was attacked. Nor did the arrival of a small army contingent stop the battle. Shots were fired. A man was killed. The soldiers were forced to surrender and the house was burned. The stills of anyone who paid the excise were destroyed. The barns of anyone who dared say a word for the government were burned. Government representatives were stripped, tarred, and feathered, and even seared with hot irons. All enforcement of law ceased. A mail carrier was attacked, the mails rifled, and correspondence persecuted as a result of the letters that were found. Sober warnings that the acts of the insurgents would be considered treason were laughed down. So that's what took place. Now, Washington interpreted these events almost immediately not as youthful rebellion, not as what Jefferson would call watering the tree of liberty with the blood of tyrants or anything like that. He interpreted this rebellion in the context of Shays' rebellion 8 years earlier in Western Massachusetts, which had brought down the authority of the Articles of Confederation. So Washington immediately defined the Whiskey Rebellion as a threat to the authority and the legitimacy of the nation. He called up 13,000 troops and he personally led them west to subdue the rebellion. This is Washington, the President of the United States, the Commander-in-Chief, as the head of the army, leading 13,000 troops into western Pennsylvania to subdue the rebellion. Now, what they found when they got there, according to the historian John C. Miller, was nothing more menacing than liberty poles bearing placards reading, "Liberty and no excise, oh whiskey." As for the rebels in arms, not one showed up, even though the army marched across the Alleghenies in search of these elusive malcontents. So they found no rebellion. Now, what does that prove? Well, it might prove that the initial report of all of what happened was trumped up and exaggerated and there was nothing there to find, and that Washington and Hamilton had made fools of themselves. Or it could mean that it was the threat of this strong response led by the Commander-in-Chief himself that caused the rebels to disperse and prevented the Whiskey Rebellion from turning into a mass uprising like Shays' Rebellion. Guess what? If you were inclined to support Hamilton and a strong government, you would take the latter interpretation. If you were inclined to support Jefferson's belief that the tree of liberty should be watered from time to time with the blood of tyrants, you would be inclined to take the former position. So the question then becomes, Washington's the president, what does he do about this? He took the position that it was the army going out there that deterred the rebellion from getting serious, but he said, this kind of disturbance needs to be caught at its source and removed, or we'll have worse. And he identified the source of the rebellion as these democratic societies that were supporting the French government. He was influenced in this view, no doubt, by Alexander Hamilton. And in his 1794 annual message, that's the State of the Union message, Washington publicly called out these pro-French societies as the cause and said they must be stopped. That action toppled Washington's position of being above the fray and above the battle and the embodiment of virtue. Aha, said Jefferson supporters, Washington has exposed himself as being a Federalist, a Hamiltonian at heart. And as a result, in his last year in office, Washington became the subject of extreme vilification. This is the part of US history most of us didn't study in school. Thomas Paine, the author of Common Sense, issued a diatribe to Washington in which he said, "As to you, sir, treacherous in private friendship and a hypocrite in public life, the world will be puzzled to decide whether you are an apostate or an impostor, whether you have abandoned good principles or whether you ever had any." Now, that's pretty strong stuff. James Monroe, the future president, accused Washington of trying to deliver the country hand and foot back to England and King George III, and cited Jay's Treaty as further proof that this is what Washington was doing. And Benjamin Franklin's grandson, whose name was Benjamin Bache, and who published a newspaper that could be fairly described as intemperate, earned himself the nickname of Lightning Rod Jr. When Washington left office, he wrote this: "Washington is the source of all the misfortunes of our country. If ever there was a period for rejoicing, this is the moment. Every heart in unison with the freedom and happiness of the people ought to beat high with exultation that the name of Washington from this day ceases to give a currency to political iniquity and to legalized corruption." Washington's credibility was in bad shape, and it was in an attempt to restore it that he gave his famous farewell address in which he warned against the dangers of faction. Well, you know, that horse was already out of the barn, and there was not much that he could do to stop it. And in fact, in the next 4 years, things got even worse, got much more intense. And I'll run through this very quickly. It was discovered that France had attempted to interfere in the 1796 election and to influence the American electorate to support Jefferson, who was running against John Adams. It was a very close election. There was almost no popular vote, but in the Electoral College, there was only a 3-vote difference between Adams and Jefferson. So the story came out that French agents in the US had attempted to interfere and influence the election result. And this led to a widespread public outcry against France. France had also been interfering with American neutral rights in response to the Jay's Treaty. President Adams sought to negotiate these differences, and so he sent a negotiating team to France, who was told that before the French would even consider negotiations, that the Americans would need to pay a substantial sum of money to 3 agents designated as X, Y, and Z. And again, if you remember way in the back of your mind from studying in school, the XYZ affair, that's what it was all about. The Americans, of course, refused. And this generated a very strong anti-French feeling in the US, which led the Congress in 1798 to pass 4 acts known collectively as the Alien and Sedition Acts. This was the first attempt to control immigration. If you see contemporary resonance in some of these things, you're getting my point. The Alien and Sedition Acts not only sought to control immigration, and they were directed primarily against France, but they also sought to control the common law crime of sedition, which meant essentially speaking out against the government. So it was a clear limitation on the First Amendment. Those acts, in turn, overreached and triggered a backlash to them, which took the form of the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, which asserted the power of the states to determine whether acts of Congress were constitutional or not, and declared that the Alien and Sedition Acts were not. I'll have more to say about the Alien and Sedition Acts in July, if there's anybody left with us then, to explore where the argument about federalism and states' rights came from. All of this led into the election of 1800, which may well be the most negative campaign that we have ever had. It was a no-holds-barred competition. Adams was quoted out of context as favoring monarchy, and Jefferson, if I can find my Jefferson paper here. Jefferson was attacked as somebody that had to desert all the political offices that he had held. One of the newspapers said, "You've been a governor, an ambassador, and a secretary of state, and had to desert each of these posts from that weakness of nerves, want of fortitude, and total imbecility of character, which have marked your whole political career and most probably will attend you to your grave." He was accused of starting the French Revolution and trying to recreate it in America. But the issue that received the most attention was Jefferson's religion. Jefferson was what was called a deist. He believed in a deity, but did not subscribe to any organized religion. And he was widely accused of atheism. One of the more popular pamphlets from the campaign said, "The grand question stated is at the present solemn and momentous epoch, the only question to be asked by every American, laying his hand on his heart, is, shall I continue in allegiance to God and a religious president, or impiously declare for Jefferson and no God?" And there are lots of other examples of attacks on his religion. Jefferson ran with Aaron Burr as his vice presidential running mate. Although everybody understood that that was the case, that's not the way the electors voted at that time. They cast 2 votes, and whoever got the most was president, whoever got the next most was vice president. There was an 8-vote difference between Jefferson and Adams. But Jefferson and Burr, his supposed running mate, ended up with the same number of electoral votes because one elector had failed to throw away one of his votes and cast it for somebody else other than Burr. So, with neither candidate having an electoral college majority, the election went into the House of Representatives, where a lot of Federalists thought they would make some great mischief by supporting Burr, whom they thought would be easier for them to defeat next time around. So it took 36 ballots in the House to elect Jefferson president, and the election was not decided until about 2 weeks before Jefferson was scheduled to take office. Now, it's in that context that Jefferson delivered his first inaugural address. This is a remarkable speech because it attempts fairly successfully to reset the political context of the 1790s away from this polarization. The key line in Jefferson's inaugural is he said, "Every difference of opinion is not a difference in principle. We are all Republicans. We are all Federalists. Now, both Republican and Federalist were with lowercase opening letters. He didn't mean to suggest that everybody belonged to both parties, but he meant to suggest that everybody believed in a federal structure with divided sovereignty, and everybody believed in a republic rather than a monarchy. So with agreement on those first principles, he's maintaining, we can sublimate policy differences and not see them in such an ultimate sense as we had done throughout the 1790s. Now, the way I want to wrap this up is by suggesting that these two models, the model of the 1790s and the model of Jefferson's inaugural, suggest two different ways of political argument. The Jeffersonian discourse, once he's in office, as opposed to what he was doing in the early 1790s, is like Talmudic argument. Those who've studied the Talmud will quickly remember that the controversies are decided for the moment, usually by majority rule, but both the majority and the minority positions are maintained and respected, and it's recognized that under different circumstances, the controversy could reappear and could be decided the other way. There's no final victories in the assumption of Talmudic argument. And in the kind of political argument that Jefferson's first inaugural represented, there's no final victories because these are not differences in principle. We share basic principles. As I said at the outset, we did during the 50s and 60s and into the early 70s. But the discourse of the 1790s is akin to what we would think of as polarizing argument. It magnifies the significance of any controversy by seeing it as the thin entering wedge, the first step in something larger. It anticipates a slippery slope that's going to take us down the road to disaster. Matters of first principle are at stake, and there's no room for compromise. So the conclusion I reach is American public discourse has been characterized sometimes by one, sometimes by the other. Our current discourse is characterized mostly, in my opinion, by polarizing rhetoric. And it's not just a natural polarization that reflects the actual conditions of the country. It's an artificial polarization that was brought about, among other things, by the statement of Senator McConnell that I quoted at the beginning, to oppose whatever Obama proposes on any topic, and to define themselves as unflagging opposition. Well, there have been other attempts like that to deliberately polarize the public on the assumption that you could then mobilize a slight majority in your favor, and much of our politics for the past 25 years has been of that kind. But if we take the long view, we polarized over the tariff in the 1830s because of what it could lead to or not lead to. We polarized over the expansion of the American territory in the 1840s because it would either legitimize or undermine slavery. We polarized certainly over slavery itself and over the approach to Reconstruction and over partisan patronage in the 1880s and the tariff in the 1890s and so on and so forth. So that if we look across the broad sweep of our history, it's not fair to say that what we experienced when we were becoming adults is the norm. It's part of the norm, but it's also part of the norm to have a politics that polarizes. And this is a difference between one kind of argument that's like the Talmud and another kind of argument that's like a quick reduction to first principles. Well, I have talked long enough, and I realize that what I've covered is maybe obscure in some parts or to some of you. And in response to the question I got in the chat, no, it will not be on the final. That's one of the things that's great about adult education is there's no final. But let me stop at this point, and I've asked Marcy to moderate to recognize people who would like to make comments or challenges or ask questions or push further.
Put me on.
Your face?
If you would like to ask a question, raise your hand. I think Mr. Erlbacher. Yeah.
All right. I think your analysis was wonderful.
Thank you.
I would simply add one small point, and that is if you look at George Washington, even before the Confederation, during the war, on each of these issues, he always comes down against the weak Confederation. He's always for a strong. I used to call him, when I taught, a closet Federalist. Because he really, and on each of the big issues, he ended up with Hamilton, not with Jefferson. Although he did try to reconcile them personally.
Yeah, that's all true. And as commander during the Revolution, he was very much in favor of strong central authority, and he saw directly the weaknesses of the Confederation government.
Absolutely.
Before he agreed to become a delegate to the Constitutional Convention, realizing that the Constitutional Convention would elect him president, he calculated in his mind whether there was a chance to overthrow the Articles of Confederation and get something different, and concluded that there was. So that part is true. But as president, he initially tried to enact a role sort of like the monarch as a head of, head of the country, but not the head of the government, and that he was above all that fray, and that didn't last. And so your analysis would say, well, he reverted to type, and that may well be. Thanks for the comment, Al.
Very.
Yeah. There's 4 screens. So, yeah, Michael, I think is, right?
I'm sorry, you mean Joel?
Oh, is it Joel? Sorry.
Yes, that's okay. David, I was struck by your very opening when you suggested that there really was an expectation that there would be no factions and no political parties. And I will claim I know more US history than English history, but am I wrong that in the already by this end of the 17th century, beginning of the 18th century, there were political parties in England?
Right.
So why were they so surprised then?
Well, they thought they could avoid it by creating a written constitution that balanced all these interests across each other. And they were all of the same worldview. I mean, that's what I was getting at when I said the convention was fairly homogeneous in terms of worldview. They didn't represent difference among themselves.
I'm looking. If I'm not seeing you, oops. Yeah. The foxes, right?
Hi, thank you for a very interesting historical perspective. I just have one question. My memory of the 50s, 60s, and 70s is, who is the McCarthyism, civil rights problems, Vietnam War, Nixon's impeachment, riots, burning cities. I have a very different memory of those decades, apparently, David, than you do. I'm wondering what you would say about that.
No, I tried to say there was fairly intense conflict during those decades, but it was conflict within a general frame of reference that was commonly understood. So, for example, in the McCarthy period, nobody was objecting to the position that communism was a mortal threat to the United States and we needed to protect ourselves against it. There was intense disagreement about McCarthy's methods. The Civil Rights Revolution was a very significant, very important revolution in the 60s. But outside of the segregationist South, it was a movement that was calling on America to live out its own principles in the same way that the Swedish writer Myrdal had described in the 1940s, that it's a conflict between the American creed and actual behavior. but the creed is widely accepted. Nixon was a highly polarizing figure, or seemed so at the time. But if you look back at Nixon, much less so. In fact, I don't know that Nixon would be a Republican today if you look at what he championed and what he did. So what I'm trying to suggest is at the level of fundamental assumptions, there was much wider agreement during those years than there is now. Not that there weren't intense
Sometimes
or heated controversies.
a way to raise your hand.
Marcy, I think that Lori Merrill had a question.
Thank you.
Sure. I got part of it in the chat, but not all of it.
Lori?
Yeah, I actually sent it before I finished typing, but because I'm not so comfortable doing the chat, but then I restated it. So my question is really, like, can we ever get anything done when there's such extreme polarization? And, when could we ever reach a situation where there's like compromise that reaches some meaningful accomplishments?
Well, the answer to that sort of depends on what your standard is for getting something done. I'll take a very contemporary example. Notwithstanding the current highly polarized environment, Congress reached bipartisan agreement on criminal justice reform about a year ago. And that was a situation in which people came to the same result for strikingly different reasons. And that can occasionally happen. It doesn't happen very often, which is why I think the list of accomplishments of recent Congresses under recent presidents is not extremely long. But that can happen even during a period of intense polarization. These periods of intense polarization have historically run their course. And sometimes it's because the issue involved just no longer seems so important, like the tariff, which receded around the turn of the 20th century. Sometimes it's because there's an external threat. I had thought originally that the coronavirus situation might have induced a certain degree of unity and compromise, but it appears itself to have been interpreted from widely different perspectives. But occasionally, yes. I'm not totally hopeless.
Okay. Yeah, Megan. Ed Megan. Yeah.
This is Joan. Thank you very much. I have two questions about the idea of these kind of polarized factions. Didn't Madison say, as part of the ratification part of the Constitution, when they were going through that factions could be good. They would be natural factions. People with common interests would get together. They would be able to push for what they wanted, and then they would go about their merry way. And then another issue would come up, and then a new faction would form, and it may or may not be part of the same people, but it would allow people a voice that would, for some issue, some resolution of the issue. On the other side, when the political parties did form, each of them had their own newspapers. I mean, they were clearly, boldly partisan. There was no pretense that they were trying to be objective. So
Right.
you have really kind of conflicting things going on.
Well, Madison made his comment about faction checking faction in the Federalist Paper number 10 in an attempt to get the Constitution ratified. He was envisioning many factions. In fact, he's making this argument in defense of having a large republic in opposition to the widespread belief that only a small country could be governed by a republic. And it's an ingenious argument, but it precedes the development of political parties or the coalescence into two major factions. So in some ways, it sounds like it's an inconsistent position, but in a way, he's not talking about exactly the same thing.
Thank you.
Marcy, you're muted.
muted.
Muted. Thank you. So let's go Mark Schoenfield and then Nancy and Jerry Fink and then Bob.
David, and I truly have no idea about the answer to the question I'm about to ask you. Is this a function of American culture, or is this part of the human condition where if we looked at other democracies or forms of democracy, democratic republics, will we find the same kind of ebb and flow as a function of human nature? To give you a simple question.
Well, I'm not sure I know the answer either. What I was trying to say is that it got started out of a flawed assumption about human nature, namely that differences would not pretty automatically emerge. But that's how it got started. How it has ebbed and flowed, you know, I'm really not prepared to theorize because the answer has been different at different times. And I don't really know enough detail about other democratic societies across a period of time to be able to say. I suspect if I had to take a guess, I would guess that human beings by nature are both united and divided, and that any system of government needs to account for both unity and division, or it won't work. So I would come down on the side of your human nature option, but that's only a guess.
Okay. Nancy, Jerry.
David, again, thank you so much for enlightening us and reminding us that polarization has been the nature of our history, and there's nothing new here, nor is there nothing new. There's nothing new about media support for polarization. One difference that seems to exist now, and you used the example going back to the 1790s, is that the factions basically were pretty equally split. You didn't belong to one or the other and be tugged by the arguments of the other side. But here, the factions are so nuanced, whether it's the Republican Party, the Democratic Party, the right or the left. You have groups within each faction that are tugged by other interests. Take an example, Republicans who are very pro-Israel, or you have Republicans that are pro-gay. You have within each of these highly polarized sections subgroups that are directed to something that would be contrary to the majority of their particular faction. And the other thing I appreciate your comment on is this is something that seems to be somewhat unique now as opposed to past polarization. We have large groups that are questioning the very legitimacy of our government system. I didn't see that in the past, where you had large groups questioning the very legitimacy of the government.
Let me take the second part first. I think you're right about that. In the past, it would be much more common to question the legitimacy of the ruling administration for one reason or another. It has become more common in recent years to say, as George Wallace did in another context, there's not a dime's worth of difference between them. There's Tweedledum and Tweedledee. That both parties are corrupt, that they're both under the thumb of large business and so on and so forth. That's a fairly contemporary theme. It did surface slightly during the period before the Civil War, when the two major parties were the Whigs and the Democrats, and the argument that neither one of them really represented free soil sentiment is what ultimately contributed to the demise of the Whigs and the birth of the Republicans. But it's become much more common in recent years. On the first part of your comment, I think you're certainly right, but I think that is less true than it used to be. I don't dispute the examples that you've mentioned, but it seems to me when you can take, for example, the 100 members of the Senate and line them up on an ideological scale and find that the most conservative Democrat is to the left of the most liberal Republican, that would suggest that the two parties have become more homogeneous than they used to be. And I think that's the result primarily of the exodus of Southern Democrats from the Democratic Party and the exodus of Northeastern liberal Republicans from the Republican Party. And we can debate the causes for that, but I think it relates fundamentally to civil rights and race.
Thank you. Bob, did you still have a question?
Yeah, I still have actually one comment. Wasn't Madison's response to the Constitution the Bill of Rights a couple of years later? And second, as far as polarization, at least modern, how long does it usually last? Because the current one has lasted, I would say at least 26 years. And I would probably start with Newt Gingrich starting all of this, and it just proceeded to get worse. And if you want to go back even a little bit further, possibly when we had the big battle over Robert Bork in 1987. I just wanted your comments on both the modern thing and also Madison's response with the Bill of Rights.
Well, let me take Madison first. He's an interesting figure. Madison was originally opposed to the Bill of Rights, to the idea of a Bill of Rights, because he thought that if you enumerated rights, that would mean that there were no other rights. And he took the position that the Constitution was a document of reserved powers, that anything it didn't enumerate was reserved. He changed his mind during the ratification controversy when he saw how intense the sentiment was in so many different states to have a Bill of Rights. And he promised that if the Constitution were ratified, he, as a member of Congress, would champion a Bill of Rights, which he did. And he became identified with the Bill of Rights as it finally was adopted. But that's an evolution in his thinking. To the second part of your question, I think that the period that we are now in has gone on longer than usual. And I don't know whether that's a new normal or what. I don't know what the current year's election results, whatever they turn out to be, will do to that. I think, I don't know that I want to say much more than that. There are all different kind of culprits identified for having started it out, including the ones that you mentioned. The Bork one, I don't think is as persuasive a suggestion, because there were several Supreme Court nominations subsequent to Bork that kind of went through under the old guidelines and assumptions, and then became polarized again with the more recent nominations.
Thank you. John, I think, right?
Yes, to go back a little before the Constitution, in both Aristotle and Plato, my recollection is, had distrusted popular government and factions, and both ended up saying that government should be done by a virtuous person or a small group of people, and that you could not have, as was brought up in the ratification of the Constitution, that a big country couldn't be a republic, a big country couldn't be a democracy, that it didn't work, that it would break down, kind of the way we're experiencing today. That's just something to throw out to discuss.
Well, I think you're right. And I think the founders shared those assumptions, but they thought that there were more virtuous people than Plato and Aristotle were willing to grant, because they all thought of themselves as virtuous people. And the Federalist number 10 by Madison that we were talking about earlier in a slightly different context was intended to make the quite radical claim that, contrary to expectation, a large government could work very effectively by keeping lots of factions in check. Of course, that did not anticipate the phenomenon of national factions. I mean, that's my quick thought on what you've said.
Thanks, David. I'm scanning. Am I missing somebody here? Can unmute yourself and offer a comment or a question.
Hi, it's excuse me, it's Rudy Lubov.
Hi, Rudy.
Hi, David, and everybody. In the 60s, I don't want to admit that I thought of this idea, but or that I supported this idea, but it seems to me that I remember some of my friends' rallying cries were overthrow the military industrial complex. That's and there were all kinds of arguments that on the radical left about guns and who should own guns, which by the way are emerging now as well. I've heard echoes of those arguments that we used to those endless arguments that we used to have. That flies in the face of what you said earlier about the 60s and early 70s.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I may have misstated what I was trying to get across. There were fierce controversies during those years. And for people who were caught up in those controversies, they were fundamental controversies.
Yes, they were. Very much.
But for instance, people who said overthrow the military-industrial complex
yes.
were getting at the idea of a complex that had excessive power because it combined these two different institutions in a way
Correct.
that President Eisenhower had warned against in his farewell address. That's not an argument that says get rid of the military, for example.
That's true. Well, they wanted to change the role of the military very fundamentally.
Yes, that's
but
right.
But it's true that they didn't want to get rid of it totally.
Right.
So at the base, you would say that there was consensus.
Yeah. Now, I may have overstated the point. In order to make the claim that people see where we are today as aberrant. And it may well be that those years were aberrant, or it may be that there's a kind of ebb and flow to it, which is really the argument that I want to advance.
I would probably agree with that because I see some of the same some of the shades of the same radical arguments that we argued in the 60s about whether people should own guns, because the far left was arguing that we should own guns because
right.
we would need to defend ourselves against a very fascist, rightist type of government. And in civil rights, I predict that the arguments, there was this whole wave of whether whites should join the civil rights organizations. And in fact, I included, and a lot of whites were thrown out of CORE and SNCC
right.
because when Black Power became the rallying cry, as far as I'm concerned, it was understandable, but I believe that we're going to go through some of the shadows of the same, not shadows, but they were patterns that that I wouldn't be very surprised if we go through some of those same arguments and patterns moving forward.
Although it's interesting, at least in these early stages so far, the overwhelming presence of whites in the protest marches and demonstrations is remarkable.
Yes, and they're saying that the reason that things are changing is because so many white people have come out to support Black Lives Matter and all the other kinds of organizations that are supporting those kinds of changes. They're saying now that what has made a difference is the fact that there were so many white people, that there seems to be much more of a consensus around the virtue of the things that Black Lives Matter and the other organizations stand for. It was like a reawakening rather than, but still, I sort of predict that there's going to be a kind of, after perhaps, hopefully something gets done, I wouldn't be surprised if then there is at some point, a reaction and a fight again about who's going to control and lead those groups.
You may be right. You may be right. One of the characteristics of the current protest is it's pretty much leaderless. I mean, it's developed spontaneously in thousands of cities.
So there's going to be a struggle for leadership, and the question is who's going to inevitably, leaders will rise. And those were, there were so many factions in the 60s and the early 70s. There were so many factions and so many ideas. Society really was, it seemed to me, and it was in a fulcrum of change. And
right.
But when you look at police brutality, you wonder whether there really was such a lot of change. Certain issues, of course, we've had great movement.
Oh yes, oh yes.
So anyway, that was my thought.
Thank you, Rudy.
Maybe time for one more if there's somebody who wants to offer. Ellen?
Yeah, and thank you, Dave. This is really wonderful.
Thank you.
We've been talking about the polarization in terms of basically ideologies, which is, in general, it seems throughout history what it's been, one ideology against the other. But I think, isn't it there also from over time, the individual players who are polarizing, as we have now, where it goes beyond just the ideology, and you get, I want to say, less virtuous individual players leading those ideologies like we have now. You had talked about, you mentioned this wonderful, was it the 1800s, a presidential election that was like truly ugly. It got really, really ugly.
Yes. Yes,
I mean, but they're in another case where the individual, almost the individual over the ideology, also had some polarizing.
That's true. That's true. The 1800 election was argued much more over the individual character of both candidates.
As is what we're in, that's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
So you're talking about, I think that we do go through human nature, and we go through these things that repeat themselves as a character like this arises.
Yeah, that's right.
In the scene.
That's right. Well, thank you all very much for putting up with that and for your patience. And next month we'll talk about federalism and states' rights, and we'll see if we can relate that to the Talmud.
Thank you, David. We are really in debt and the challenge.
My pleasure.
Thank you, David.
Thank you, David.
Thanks, it was great.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
This was a good time, good lecture. Thanks so much, David.
Oh, you're very welcome. My pleasure.
There's another speaker next Thursday, Wednesday evening. I don't know, Mark just got off, but Rabbi Josh Weinberg will be speaking on Israel, on some of the WZO elections, as well as the Israeli elections and what it might mean for us as Reform Jews. So
good.
Take care, everybody. Have a good week and a nice Shabbat when it comes. There are 57 screens on tonight.
Good.
Some of those screens had more than one person, right, Joan? It's so.
Right. For it.
Hi, Greta, again. Um,
Joan, I see you right front and center there.
Right. There we go.
Okay. Okay, thanks, David. Thanks, Marcy.
Sure. Really.
A lot to absorb. The more things change, the more they remain the same.
Well, there's some of that.
Fine.
Yeah.
I thought I would quote Kohelet, but I decided not to. Nothing new under the sun.
Time for this, a time for that, right?
For all seasons.
All right, you guys, take care.
Good night.
Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Good night.
I'm gonna push the end to the meeting, okay? Good night.
Okay.